Hello, and welcome to The Unseen Question. When people talk about the Council of Nicaea, they often frame it as a purely religious event, bishops gathering to define the nature of God, to settle a theological dispute, and to preserve the faith. But the reality was far more complicated. It was not just about belief. It was about power, politics, and control over a rapidly changing empire. The year was 325 CE. The Roman Empire had just come through a period of instability and division. Constantine, the emperor, had recently consolidated power, emerging as the single ruler of a vast and fractured land. His priority was not theology, not spiritual truth, but unity. He understood that religion had become a powerful tool to stabilize and manage the empire. By this time, Christianity had grown from a small, persecuted sect into a movement with influence and numbers, and Constantine knew it could serve him. But Christianity was not a single unified body. It was splintered. Dozens of interpretations existed, competing, sometimes violently, for dominance. Different communities had different texts, different rituals, and different views on who or what Jesus was. Some saw him as fully divine, others as fully human, and many landed somewhere in between. The debate was not abstract, it was explosive. It threatened to fracture communities, fuel unrest, and undermine the unity Constantine needed. This is where the Council of Nicaea enters the picture. Constantine called it not out of devotion, but out of necessity. He needed a unified church because a unified church meant a more stable empire. And when theology gets mixed with politics, the result is rarely about truth. It's about who holds authority to define truth. The most pressing issue at Nicaea was the dispute between Arius and his opponents. Arius argued that Jesus was not eternal, that he was created by God and therefore subordinate. To Arius, Jesus was exalted but not equal to God. This idea was popular, especially in the eastern parts of the empire, but it deeply unsettled others who believed Jesus must be fully divine, co-eternal with God. If he wasn't, they feared the entire structure of salvation, as they saw it, would collapse. At first glance, this might seem like a hair-splitting debate, but it wasn't just about philosophy. It was about who could claim authority over the faith. A view like Arius's gave communities more interpretive freedom. A view that declared Jesus as equal to God placed control in the hands of bishops who could then claim they spoke on behalf of divinity itself. The higher the pedestal for Jesus, the higher the pedestal for those who claim to guard his legacy. Constantine, of course, didn't care about the nuances. He wasn't baptized until much later in life, and even then by an Arian bishop, ironically. His concern was political. He wanted the fighting to stop, and he wanted a single creed that could be enforced across the empire, a single narrative to replace the chaos of competing voices. So at Nicaea, under the shadow of imperial pressure, the bishops debated, but it wasn't a free marketplace of ideas. The emperor was present not as a passive observer, but as a looming force, and in such an environment, theology became secondary to power dynamics. To disagree with the wrong side was not simply to lose an argument, it was to risk exile, punishment, and loss of status. What emerged from the council was the Nicene Creed, a statement that declared Jesus as of the same substance as God, fully divine, eternal, inseparable. This wasn't the outcome of a purely spiritual quest. It was the product of negotiation, compromise, and ultimately political enforcement. What makes this especially telling is what happened next. Those who resisted the creed were branded heretics. They were silenced, exiled, and their writings destroyed. The goal was not just to clarify theology, it was to erase competing views, to cement one interpretation as official, and to wield it as a tool of authority. When you look at it this way, the Council of Nicaea wasn't a gathering to discover divine truth. It was the formalization of power structures. It marked the beginning of Christianity's transformation from a diverse set of beliefs into an institution tightly linked with imperial authority. The Nicene decision was not a natural evolution of belief. It was an act of selection. One side of the debate was elevated to truth, while the others were condemned to obscurity. But those condemned voices had been real communities, real people, with genuine convictions. What the council did was not just define orthodoxy, it defined heresy, and that division was enforced by political muscle, not by reason alone. This enforcement matters, because once a version of faith becomes entangled with state power, dissent isn't just disagreement. It becomes disobedience. Heresy became a crime not just against God, but against the empire itself. And with that, Religion ceased to be a matter of personal conviction. It became a tool for control. The irony is striking. Early Christians had once railed against imperial power, standing as outsiders persecuted for their refusal to conform to Roman authority. But within a few generations, their own movement became a mirror of the system they had resisted. Once the empire realized that faith could unify people more effectively than brute force alone, the tables turned. Faith became law, and law enforced faith. It's tempting to think that the bishops at Nicaea were simply searching for clarity, but clarity was not the end goal. Consensus was not the kind reached organically, but the kind imposed under pressure. Even the language of same substance was chosen not because it reflected an obvious truth, but because it served as a boundary marker. It was precise enough to exclude dissenters, yet broad enough to be enforced as official doctrine. What's often overlooked is that the council didn't settle things permanently. Far from it. After Nicaea, disputes raged on. Different emperors favored different factions. Arianism, the very position condemned at the council, returned to prominence under Constantine's successors. Some emperors even reversed the council's decisions and exiled the bishops who had enforced them. That constant back and forth reveals the truth. These decisions were not settled by evidence or revelation, but by whichever faction held imperial favor at the time. In other words, theology followed politics, not the other way around. When you look at the history of belief through this lens, it's clear that what survives as orthodoxy is not necessarily the best argument. It's the argument that aligned with power. When power shifts, orthodoxy shifts, and over centuries, the version that prevails gets rewritten as if it had always been the inevitable truth. The Council of Nicaea is a perfect case study in this. The story often told is that bishops, guided by divine inspiration, clarified the eternal nature of Christ. The story less often told is that this clarity was the product of political necessity, compromise, and suppression. It raises a bigger question. If divine truth really needed to be settled by imperial councils, by votes and compromises, then how divine could it have been? If a truth requires the machinery of empire to survive, maybe what we're looking at isn't truth at all, but politics dressed up as theology. And this leads to another insight. The council was not just about Jesus, it was about authority over knowledge itself. By standardizing belief, the church established itself as the sole interpreter of truth. Competing texts, ideas, and traditions were gradually pushed out. What remained was not a natural consensus, but a curated version of history. This is why so many early Christian writings are lost, or were deliberately destroyed. Dozens of gospels, letters, and commentaries existed, but only a handful survived into the canon, not because they were inherently better, but because they were sanctioned. The rest were buried, burned, or dismissed as dangerous. When people today read the Bible, they're reading not the full history of Christian thought, but the edited version that survived imperial approval. In this sense, the Council of Nicaea was not just about theology, it was about control of memory, shaping the past to secure the future. The decisions made at Nicaea didn't just echo through the 4th century, they set the template for the relationship between religion and power for the next 1,000 years. Once belief was standardized and tied to imperial authority, the church was no longer just a community of faith, it became a governing force, an institution that could dictate not just ritual and worship, but thought itself. What followed was a tightening grip on interpretation. Questions that had once been debated openly became dangerous to even raise. Dissenters were branded heretics, and heresy was treated as a threat to the order of society. When belief is tied to power, a challenge to doctrine becomes indistinguishable from rebellion. This is why councils kept happening. Nicaea was the first, but not the last. Whenever disputes arose about the nature of Christ, the role of Mary, the authority of bishops, emperors, and church leaders convened new councils to hammer out truth. But in reality, these councils functioned like political summits, decisions made by majority vote, often under pressure, with losers punished or banished. That's how doctrines that billions take for granted today were forged, not by revelation, but by committees. Think about the dynamic this created. Religion was no longer about individual search for meaning or morality. It was about enforcing uniformity. The empire had discovered that controlling ideas could be more powerful than controlling armies, and the church learned that aligning with empire gave it a reach and influence it could never have achieved on its own. This partnership came at a cost. Once theology became a matter of state, flexibility disappeared. The rich diversity of early Christian thought was squeezed out. Texts that didn't fit the new orthodoxy were labeled dangerous. Communities that practiced differently were suppressed. Belief became standardized, and standardization was enforced with punishment. We can see the psychological effects of this too. When people are told that disagreement is not just wrong but sinful, when questioning becomes dangerous, the mind adapts. Doubt gets suppressed, curiosity turns into fear, and conformity is rewarded. That's how a system maintains itself, not by being right, but by making alternatives unthinkable. The Council of Nicaea is often presented as a noble moment when unity was achieved. But what kind of unity is achieved by threat and exclusion? If truth requires punishment to survive, it isn't truth at all. It's authority protecting itself. And here's the deeper irony. The creed that came out of Nicaea, designed to unify, actually sowed division for centuries. Disputes didn't end, they hardened. Schisms grew, new councils convened, and eventually Christianity split into Catholic, Orthodox, and later Protestant branches, all of them tracing their lineage back to councils like Nicaea, all of them claiming to hold the true interpretation. The political dimension becomes even clearer when we look at how emperors used these divisions. Supporting one faction or another wasn't about theology. It was a strategy, a way to consolidate loyalty, weaken rivals, or project authority over distant provinces. By controlling the narrative of faith, emperors extended their reach, and by aligning with emperors, church leaders gained influence they could never have had on their own. What emerged was a cycle. Theology gave legitimacy to empire, and empire gave enforcement to theology. Together they created a system where belief and power reinforced each other, and once that cycle started, it was nearly impossible to break. This is the real legacy of Nicaea, not simply a creed, not simply a theological statement, but the binding of religion to politics in a way that shaped Europe, the Middle East, and beyond for centuries. After Nicaea, the partnership between church and empire grew stronger, and its influence spread into every aspect of life. One of the clearest examples was education. Before this alliance, learning in the Roman world had been diverse. Philosophy, mathematics, medicine, and literature flourished across many traditions. But once the church became aligned with power, education slowly shifted. Knowledge was filtered through doctrine. What was taught had to be compatible with approved theology. This meant that questioning the nature of the universe, or the origins of life, or even the workings of the human body, could suddenly become dangerous if it conflicted with official belief. Intellectual curiosity was no longer just about exploring reality. It became a potential challenge to authority. And the safest path for most scholars was to avoid questions that could be seen as controversial. The result was a narrowing of thought. Entire fields of inquiry stalled because they didn't fit into the framework of orthodoxy. Scientific advances slowed, philosophical diversity shrank, and intellectual exploration was confined by theological boundaries. For centuries, Europe's cultural energy was channeled into debating theological minutiae rather than expanding human knowledge. The brilliance of minds was often wasted on arguments about the exact nature of Christ's divinity, rather than on medicine, technology, or understanding the natural world. And yet people often look back at this period and assume that the church preserved knowledge. But preserved for what purpose? Knowledge was preserved selectively, edited, reinterpreted, and controlled. What was inconvenient was discarded or declared dangerous. The survival of certain texts owes less to a respect for learning, and more to whether those texts could be bent to fit the prevailing religious framework. The psychology of this control is worth reflecting on. When institutions declare themselves the gatekeepers of truth, questioning becomes framed as rebellion, and rebellion becomes fearsome. People internalize the idea that doubt is not just risky, but immoral. Over time, entire populations learn to police their own thoughts. The effect is powerful. Obedience doesn't require constant force. It becomes self-sustaining, passed down generation after generation. The Council of Nicaea was the opening move in this process. By setting the precedent that belief could be decided by council, enforced by empire, and written into law, it created a model that would be repeated again and again, and the consequences were profound. The consolidation of belief became the foundation for the medieval church's authority. The suppression of alternative ideas became the template for how institutions defended themselves, and the blending of faith with power shaped the trajectory of entire civilizations. When people today think about the so-called Dark Ages, they often oversimplify. It wasn't that people were unintelligent or lacked curiosity. It was that curiosity was constrained. The boundaries of acceptable thought were drawn not by evidence, but by authority, and those boundaries were enforced with social, political, and sometimes violent consequences. The irony is sharp. A council meant to bring clarity actually clouded progress for centuries. Instead of opening the door to deeper understanding, it closed the door on anything that didn't serve orthodoxy. Instead of stabilizing faith, it set in motion cycles of conflict that fractured communities again and again, and all of this was justified as protecting truth. But truth doesn't need protection from questions. Authority does. Once belief became tied to authority, dissent could no longer be tolerated, and history is full of examples showing how brutally dissenters were treated. Those who questioned the official creed after Nicaea were not simply arguing theology, they were defying the empire's definition of truth. That meant exile, confiscation of property, or worse. Take Arius himself. His followers, known as Arians, didn't disappear after the council. In fact, their movement persisted for centuries, and at times gained majority support across whole regions. But no matter how many communities embraced Arian views, the official narrative kept branding them as heretics. When the political winds shifted, emperors alternated between tolerating them and persecuting them. The instability wasn't about evidence, but about control. This pattern repeated with other movements. Donatists in North Africa, Nestorians in the East, later Cathars and Waldensians in Europe. Each group saw itself as pursuing truth, yet each was crushed, not because their ideas were carefully refuted, but because they threatened the monopoly of orthodoxy. And the punishment for heresy was not symbolic, it was real: public burnings, torture, and imprisonment. Not because ideas are dangerous in themselves, but because authorities know that ideas spread. To silence an idea, they tried to silence the person. The effects spilled into law as well. Roman law once pragmatic and flexible, began absorbing theological categories: heresy, blasphemy, sacrilege. These became crimes defined not just by moral or civic harm, but by offense against religious authority. It blurred the line between religion and governance until the two were nearly indistinguishable. And once this framework was in place, it set a precedent that lasted well beyond Rome. Medieval Europe inherited it, and so did much of the Western legal tradition. The irony is that this mixture of religion and law claimed to protect truth and morality, but in practice, it served to protect institutions. Morality wasn't the aim, obedience was. A legal system that criminalizes belief isn't designed to nurture virtue, it's designed to secure conformity. When you see how power used faith, the pattern becomes clear. Political religion didn't just emerge at Nicaea, but Nicaea gave it structure, precedent, and legitimacy. It showed how doctrine could be standardized, enforced, and woven into the machinery of the state. And once the model proved effective, it was repeated in countless forms across history. What's even more striking is how this shaped the psychology of entire cultures. When truth is dictated from above, people stop searching for it themselves. Curiosity becomes dangerous, so obedience feels safe. Over generations, this creates populations that internalize submission, even seeing it as virtue. The council's impact wasn't just theological or political, it was psychological. It trained people to think of authority and truth as the same thing. And here lies one of the most profound consequences. When people believe truth comes only from authority, they stop recognizing the difference between what is true and what is enforced. That confusion is the perfect environment for power to thrive, and the perfect way for human progress to stall. As the centuries passed, the model forged at Nicaea became the backbone of medieval society. The fusion of faith and authority seeped into law, culture, and everyday life. Questioning doctrine wasn't just frowned upon, it was dangerous. Entire institutions were built to root out dissent, from local church courts to the vast machinery of the Inquisition. The Inquisition, often remembered for its brutality, didn't arise out of nowhere. It was the natural extension of a system where truth was defined by councils, enforced by law, and protected by punishment. The same logic that condemned Arius in the 4th century burned Giordano Bruno in the 16th. The machinery stayed the same, only the targets changed. This climate shaped the trajectory of knowledge. Instead of expanding horizons, societies spent centuries defending boundaries. Instead of asking new questions, they were told which questions could be asked. When progress did happen, it often happened in spite of institutions, not because of them. Thinkers like Galileo, Copernicus, and later Darwin pushed against a long tradition of enforced conformity. Their breakthroughs remind us that knowledge grows not from obedience but from curiosity. And yet, even with all this suppression, human curiosity never fully disappeared. Beneath the weight of orthodoxy, people still asked, wondered, and discovered. The Renaissance, the Enlightenment, the rise of science, these were not gifts of the Church, but acts of resistance to the model first formalized at Nicaea. They were attempts to reclaim truth from authority to separate inquiry from dogma. Looking back, the Council of Nicaea is often portrayed as a triumph of clarity. But when stripped of mythology, it becomes clear it was something else. It was a political maneuver, a way to enforce unity through authority, a precedent for centuries of control. It marked the moment when belief was standardized, not through free exploration, but through imperial decree. And this is why it still matters today, because the questions raised at Nicaea are not just about theology, they are about power. Who gets to define truth? Who decides what is acceptable to think, to say, to question? The answers given in 325 still echo, because the temptation to confuse authority with truth is always present. The lesson is clear. Truth does not need councils or emperors to defend it. It does not need punishment or suppression to survive. Real truth can withstand questions, challenges, and doubt. What needs protection is not truth but authority. And the Council of Nicaea shows how far authority will go to preserve itself. In the end, the politics behind the council reveals something simple, yet profound. When institutions claim a monopoly on truth, they are not preserving knowledge, they are curating power. And when power and belief become indistinguishable, the cost is not just intellectual freedom, it is human progress itself. That's the real legacy of the Council of Nicaea, not the words of the creed, but the reminder that whenever truth is decided by vote, enforced by law, and protected by punishment, what we are looking at is not truth at all, but politics.